You can't silence a voice by killing the man who speaks it. Those were the last words Charlie Kirk ever spoke. Chilling, defiant, unforgettable. But imagine this with me for just a moment. What if you were in that room, sitting among the crowd at a Utah university on what felt like an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, and you heard that sentence, knowing instantly that it wasn't just a statement, but a farewell? What would you feel? Would you freeze? Would you cry? Would you even realize what had just happened? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It's haunting, it's tragic, and it's real. The air inside that lecture hall had been thick with debate, laughter, claps, and even jeers. Charlie Kirk was a man who lived on the edge of controversy, someone who thrived in the heat of political firestorms. He wasn't afraid of boos. He wasn't afraid of questions. He wasn't afraid of confrontation. But he was never supposed to be afraid of death in that room. Not there. Not then. And yet, that is exactly what unfolded. So why does this story matter right now? Because in a nation already divided, in a time when voices are being elevated and silenced all at once, this moment stands as a chilling reminder. Freedom of speech, safety in our institutions, and the very idea of how we treat each other are all on the line. But let's step back. Before the chaos, before the sirens, before the viral clips that swept across social media, there was anticipation. Hundreds of students, parents, and activists packed into the hall. They came for answers. They came for debate. Some came to challenge, others came to cheer. And at the center of it all stood Charlie Kirk, a man many admired, many despised, but no one ignored. The clock ticked past 2:30 in the afternoon. Charlie gripped the microphone. He leaned forward with that signature intensity, the kind of focus that made his supporters feel seen and his critics feel called out. He was there to spark conversation, but no one could have predicted what else was about to be sparked. Have you ever felt a moment freeze? Like the world slowed down to a crawl just before something irreversible happened? Eyewitnesses said that's what it felt like. Seconds before the gunshot, there was a pause. A moment so small it could have gone unnoticed, yet so heavy it now lingers forever. Now think about this. An elderly man, not the kind of person you would picture in headlines about a campus shooting, stood up. His face was lined with age, his hands trembling, not from nerves, but from determination. And in that instant, time split into two, before and after. But here's the part that will send shivers down your spine. When the shooter was detained, when officers wrestled him to the ground, he said just one line. I have the right to remain silent. Cold, calculated, almost rehearsed, as if this was never about rage in the moment, but something planned, something deeper. And yet, Charlie Kirk's own last words cut sharper than any bullet. He didn't scream for help. He didn't cry out in fear. He delivered a statement, a prophecy, even, that his voice could not be killed. Can you imagine the strength it takes to do that? To look death in the eyes and declare that your ideas would live on? This wasn't just the ending of a man's life. It was the beginning of a narrative that would explode across America. Social media lit up within minutes. Clips of his last words went viral, quoted by millions, reshared endlessly. Memes, tributes, anger, tears, every corner of the internet erupted. But here's what most people don't realize. Those final words, were they spontaneous? Or had Charlie always carried that sentence in his back pocket, waiting for the right moment? Was it instinct or foresight? This is where the story twists. Because if you think this was just about one man and one tragedy, you're missing the deeper picture. His death has become a mirror, reflecting the divides, the emotions, the fears of an entire generation. His supporters say he died a hero. His critics wrestle with how to respond to a man they opposed, but cannot deny died in a moment of conviction. And yet, beneath the tears and tributes, one question remains unanswered. Who really was this elderly shooter? Why him? Why there? Why now? The stage was set for a speech. Instead, it became the stage for history. And as you'll soon discover, what happened inside that Utah lecture hall is only the beginning of a story that spirals into questions of justice, legacy, and the haunting power of silence. Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. On the campus of a Utah university, students shuffled into the lecture hall with coffee cups, backpacks, and buzzing conversations. For many of them, This was simply another chance to witness a fiery debate, to hear Charlie Kirk, a man known for his unapologetic stances and sharp tongue, go head-to-head with anyone bold enough to raise a hand during Q&A. Some came to cheer, others to challenge, and a few simply came to watch the show. But none of them could have imagined that this ordinary afternoon would end in chaos, screams, and history seared into memory. Picture it. The auditorium was packed. The air was warm, buzzing, almost electric. Security guards positioned themselves casually along the walls. Students leaned forward in their chairs, phones ready to record. Kirk stood at the center, jacket buttoned, sleeves crisp, his voice booming with the confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. His presence filled the room. For his supporters, he was a beacon of truth. For his critics, a lightning rod for outrage. And then, time fractured. It happened so quickly that many didn't even process it until much later, replaying it in their minds like a glitch in reality. 1 second, Charlie was mid-sentence, gesturing with conviction, his words cutting through the air. The next, there was a sound, loud, jarring, unnatural. For those who had never heard it before, it didn't even register as a gunshot at first. Some thought it was a microphone popping. Others thought someone had dropped a heavy object. But then came the screams. Have you ever been in a room where fear spreads faster than sound? Students dove under chairs. Some froze in shock, unable to move. Others sprinted toward the exits, tripping over one another in blind panic. The room, once filled with debate and anticipation, erupted into chaos. And at the very center of it all, Charlie Kirk. The shot rang out, and suddenly, the man whose voice had dominated headlines, podcasts, and rallies for years staggered. His face, once animated with fire, shifted in an instant to something else, pain, but also defiance. As he struggled to remain upright, he said the words that would echo far beyond that auditorium. You can't silence a voice by killing the man who speaks it. Imagine being in that room. Imagine hearing those words, not knowing they were his last, but feeling instantly that they were something different, something final. And then, eyes turned. The shooter. This is where the story takes its strangest, most chilling turn. Because the figure holding the weapon wasn't a young radical, not an angry protester, not someone you'd expect in the headlines of a campus tragedy. It was an elderly man. Gray hair, wrinkled skin, a face that seemed out of place in a crowd of college students. And yet, in his trembling hands, the gun was real. What drove him? What twisted path had led this man to stand in that lecture hall, weapon drawn, finger pulling the trigger? No one knew. Not yet. But in that moment, the shock wasn't just the act of violence. It was the identity of the one who carried it out. Police stormed the room, tackling him to the ground as students scrambled out. Handcuffs clicked shut. Cameras captured the surreal sight of an elderly man pinned to the floor. And then came his first words, chilling in their cold simplicity. I have the right to remain silent. Why those words? Why that tone? As if this was rehearsed. As if he had prepared himself not just for the act, but for the aftermath. The auditorium, once filled with voices, was now filled with sirens. Paramedics rushed to Charlie. Police dragged the shooter away. Students clung to one another, shaking, crying, whispering questions no one could answer. And here's the cruel irony. Charlie Kirk's voice had filled that room just moments before. Now, silence swallowed it whole. But those final words, those defiant last words, refused to die. Clips would spread within minutes. Phones had captured everything. On social media, his last line became immortal. But inside that room, in those raw, first moments, the scene was one of pure chaos, disbelief, and grief.
Well, for example, it created
Still,
an entire civil rights
one fact
leviathan
could
that
not
gave us
be
affirmative
ignored.
action.
The man behind the trigger wasn't a shadowy figure. He wasn't a stranger to law enforcement, nor was he just a random passerby. He had a story, and uncovering that story would reveal a web far more complex
so if you could let me finish
than
3
anyone
words
in
in.
that
Sorry, it
auditorium
allowed the
could
Department
have
of Justice
imagined.
to
Because the
go
identity
after
of the shooter and the
I
reason he
believe you
chose
said
that day,
the Civil
that
Rights
place,
Act
that
was
man,
bad and that we
would
shouldn't.
unravel a mystery no one saw coming. And it all began in that Utah university, on a stage
what's your
meant for
name?
speeches, but remembered
Sorry,
for screams.
I don't want to be like filming
But who
stuff.
exactly
I'm
was this
anonymous,
elderly
number
man?
one.
And why had he been carrying a weapon into a place meant for learning, for debate, for ideas? The answers would shake not just the audience in that room,
Hello,
but
nice
the
to meet you,
nation
Anonymous
watching
guy.
from afar.
Thank you, nice to meet you.
That's what struck so many people first. Not the gun, not the chaos, not even the words he muttered after being pinned to the ground. What struck them was his appearance, frail, aged, almost grandfatherly. His hair was silver, his back slightly stooped, his movements slower than those of the officers who restrained him. If you had seen him standing in line at a grocery store earlier that day, you would have assumed he was someone's kindly neighbor, not a man about to pull the trigger in a packed auditorium. But that's what made the moment even more shocking. Why would an elderly man, someone who had lived through decades of American history, someone who had seen wars, recessions, presidencies come and go, decide to commit such an act on that stage, on that afternoon? Think about it. We are used to seeing stories of mass shooters that follow a certain pattern: young men, often socially isolated, with troubled pasts. But this broke the mold entirely. Here was a man old enough to be Charlie Kirk's grandfather. And yet, instead of fading quietly into the background of life, he chose violence. Why? Theories spread like wildfire in the hours that followed. Some whispered about politics. Others speculated about personal grievances. A few wondered if he was mentally unstable, lashing out in confusion or paranoia. But the truth, as investigators would soon learn, was more tangled than anyone first believed. When police dragged him out of that lecture hall, students described the look on his face as unsettling. Not wild, not frantic, not even panicked. Instead, calm, almost resigned, as if he knew this was how it would end for him. He wasn't fighting. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't even crying. He simply repeated the same phrase to officers: "I have the right to remain silent." Now here's where it gets interesting. Silence, in that moment, was not just a legal right. It became a statement, a declaration, almost a twisted counterpoint to Charlie Kirk's last words. Kirk had chosen to use his dying breath to affirm that his voice could never be silenced. And this elderly gunman? He chose silence itself. The clash couldn't have been more symbolic. But symbolism doesn't answer the most pressing question. Who was he? As his name began to surface in media reports, pieces of his life slowly came to light. A retired worker, a man with no previous criminal record, a man who, according to neighbors, kept to himself. He wasn't the type who drew attention. He wasn't the type who made enemies. Or so it seemed. But was that the whole truth? Or was there more beneath the surface? Think about the possibility for a second. A man who had lived a long life, perhaps filled with quiet frustrations, perhaps consumed by hidden resentments, maybe even political radicalization that no one noticed. Did he see himself as part of something larger? Or was this deeply personal, a vendetta no one else could understand? Eyewitnesses remembered details that added to the mystery. Some claim they saw him sitting quietly in the audience for almost an hour before the shooting, not clapping, not reacting, just watching. Others said his eyes followed Charlie intensely, never blinking, never softening. And a few swore they saw him muttering under his breath long before he stood up. Was it hatred? Was it conviction? Or was it something else entirely? Investigators would soon dig into his past: financial struggles, medical records, digital footprints, social ties. They would try to piece together why a man who appeared to have lived a life of quiet anonymity decided to shatter it all in an act of public violence. But in those first hours, the only thing anyone knew was this: appearances deceive. And that's the terrifying part, isn't it? Because if someone who looked like him could pull a gun in a university auditorium, then the stereotype we hold in our minds about what danger looks like is shattered. Anyone, absolutely anyone, could carry the potential for darkness. And while the nation mourned Charlie's last words, another haunting question loomed. What words would this man eventually speak? Because silence cannot last forever. And when the shooter finally broke his silence, the truth that spilled out would shock the nation. But before we get to that revelation, you need to understand why he chose those first words and why silence became his weapon of choice. Because what he meant by saying, "I have the right to remain silent," was more than legal. It was something else entirely. And when investigators pressed him further, the answers they uncovered twisted the tragedy into something even darker. That's the question investigators, witnesses, and millions of Americans watching the aftermath online kept asking themselves. Think about it. A man had just opened fire in a crowded lecture hall. Students were screaming. Officers had him pinned to the ground. Cameras were recording. Everyone expected shouting, excuses, maybe even a deranged manifesto. Instead, he gave them nothing but 6 words. I have the right to remain silent. Cold, deliberate, almost rehearsed. Now let me ask you, was this silence really about the law, or was it about power? Because silence in that moment wasn't just the absence of words. It was a weapon. It was a shield. It was a way of saying, you won't get answers on my terms. You'll get nothing until I decide. Picture the scene again. The elderly shooter lying on the ground, cuffed, eyes half closed, face expressionless. No panic, no begging, no anger. Just those 6 words repeated like a script. And here's the irony. His silence made people lean in closer. His refusal to speak only amplified the hunger for answers. Now compare that to Charlie Kirk's final words. In the chaos, bleeding and gasping, Charlie chose to speak. He chose defiance. He chose to leave the world with a sentence that would outlive him. You can't silence a voice by killing the man who speaks it. 2 men, 2 final statements. One of silence, one of defiance. It was as if fate itself had staged a debate between them, a last clash of philosophies. On one side, a man declaring that silence is power. On the other, a man proving that words live beyond the grave. And here's where it gets even more chilling. When investigators questioned the shooter later, he didn't change. For hours, he gave them nothing. No tears, no apologies, no explanations, just silence. Think about that for a moment. We live in an age where everyone rushes to speak, to post, to explain themselves, to scream into the void of social media. But here was a man who had done the unthinkable, and instead of speaking, he said nothing. Doesn't that make you wonder what he was hiding? Silence can mean guilt. It can mean calculation. It can mean madness. But sometimes, silence speaks louder than words. And that's exactly what made his choice so terrifying. Students who were in the room later described how that silence hung over them even after the chaos ended. Some said it was scarier than the gunshot itself, because the gunshot was a moment. But the silence? That lingered. It was a void that begged to be filled, but never was. And yet, while the shooter clung to silence, Charlie Kirk's words filled that void almost instantly. Phones had captured the moment. Within minutes, his line was plastered across Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Hashtags exploded. Hashtag "You Can't Silence a Voice" became a rallying cry. His last words spread like wildfire across the globe, translated into dozens of languages, immortalized in quotes and tributes. But here's the haunting contradiction. Charlie Kirk's voice rose louder than ever in death, while the shooter seemed determined to erase his own. One man's words echoed through history, while the other's silence became a riddle no one could solve. And yet, detectives knew they couldn't let the silence stand. They dug into his life, his past, his connections. And slowly, cracks began to appear. Little fragments of his story leaked. Financial struggles, a history of grievances, political bitterness, old letters that hinted at obsession. But in that first day, all the public saw was a man who refused to speak. A man whose silence became his identity. And that left a chilling question hanging in the air. What was so dangerous, so damning, so dark, that he chose silence over confession? Because here's the truth, silence never lasts. And when the dam finally breaks, when the shooter's story finally comes to light, what emerges will not just explain his actions. It will shatter everything people thought they knew about that day. But before we get to that revelation, let's return to the other side of this story, the moment that will live forever. Charlie Kirk's final words. Because if silence was the shooter's weapon, then words were Charlie's legacy. And what he said with his dying breath has already become something larger than the man himself. And the story of those words, their meaning, their timing, their impact, is only just beginning. That's how people are already describing it. Charlie Kirk's last words weren't just dramatic. They weren't just emotional. They were cinematic. Almost too perfect to be real. In those final moments, when most people would cry out for help or slip into silence, he chose to speak with clarity and conviction. You can't silence a voice by killing the man who speaks it. Now pause with me here. Do you realize the weight of that line? It wasn't just about himself. It was about the idea of speech, of defiance, of standing against forces bigger than any one person. He didn't beg. He didn't plead. He declared. And that declaration turned him, instantly, from a controversial figure into a martyr for free speech in the eyes of his followers. Imagine being in that audience. Blood on the floor, students crying, officers storming in, and amid all of it, hearing words that sounded less like desperation and more like prophecy. Eyewitnesses say the room froze. Some gasped. Some burst into tears on the spot. One student said, "It was like he knew those would be his last words, and he wanted to make them count." But here's the question that keeps gnawing at people. Were they spontaneous, or were they prepared? Did Charlie Kirk improvise them in the heat of death, or had he carried that line with him, ready to deliver if the moment ever came? It's not impossible. Public figures often keep last lines tucked away, words they'd want remembered if tragedy struck. Think of presidents, activists, even artists. They know the power of legacy. So did Charlie know? Did he sense the danger? Was this line already in his pocket, waiting? The thought chills you, doesn't it? Because if it was spontaneous, it shows remarkable presence of mind in the face of death. But if it was prepared, then it suggests he was living with the expectation that someone, someday, might try to silence him. And that's a terrifying thought all on its own. Regardless of how the line came to be, its impact was immediate. Within minutes, those words were everywhere. Phones captured the audio. Clips spread across TikTok, Twitter, Instagram. Memes, tributes, graphics with his face and his final quote flooded the internet. Hashtags like hashtag Charlie Kirk, hashtag final words, and hashtag you can't silence a voice trended worldwide. For his supporters, the message was clear. Charlie Kirk had won, even in death. He had proven that ideas live longer than bodies, that voices echo louder than bullets. For his critics, however, the reaction was complicated. Some hesitated to comment at all, unsure how to respond to a man they opposed in life, but couldn't deny had delivered a powerful line in death. Others dismissed it as theatrics. But whether you loved him or hated him, you couldn't ignore him. And here's where the story takes a twist. Because as those words spread, so did conspiracy theories. People started asking, how could his last words have been recorded so perfectly? How did the audio sound so clear amid the chaos? Was there a microphone glitch? Was someone feeding lines? Was it real? Skeptics online argued the moment was too perfect. They claimed it looked staged, that maybe he had rehearsed it, or worse, that recordings had been doctored. Supporters, on the other hand, insisted it was divine timing, proof that his message was meant to live beyond his body. But one thing no one could deny, the world was listening. Those words leapt beyond the borders of politics, entering the realm of history. They were printed on T-shirts, chanted at rallies, etched into murals. Already, his supporters were framing them as the modern-day equivalent of Patrick Henry's, "Give me liberty or give me death." Yet, beneath the swelling tribute, the tears, the outrage, one detail remained unanswered. Had Charlie looked directly at the shooter when he spoke them? Several eyewitnesses swore he locked eyes with the elderly man. Others said he was staring upward, almost as if addressing the world beyond. That single detail matters. Because if he looked the shooter in the eye, the words become a direct act of defiance. If he looked upward, they become a prayer, a message to history itself. So which was it? The truth, as more footage trickles out, may answer that question. But even without the certainty, one fact remains. Those final words reshaped everything. They transformed the tragedy from an act of silencing into an act of amplification. And yet, there's another layer to this story. Because even as Charlie's last words went viral, footage from the shooter began to emerge as well. Students with shaky phones, their hands trembling, had captured the gunman in the moments before he fired. And in his eyes, some claim, they saw something haunting. A look, a glare, a flicker of intent that, when slowed down, seemed to reveal more than silence ever could. And those videos would raise chilling questions that no one was prepared to answer. That's not exaggeration, it's exactly what happened. As paramedics fought to keep Charlie Kirk alive, as police swarmed the campus, as students clung to each other in shock, something else was already spreading like wildfire. His final sentence. You've seen how fast news travels online. But this wasn't just news, it was a lightning strike. Students who had recorded the moment uploaded it instantly. Twitter feeds lit up. TikTok loops replayed the grainy clip over and over. Instagram flooded with screenshots of his face in those final seconds. And every post carried the same chilling line. You can't silence a voice by killing the man who speaks it. Hashtags exploded. Hashtag Charlie Kirk. Hashtag final words. Hashtag you can't silence a voice. Within an hour, the phrase was trending worldwide. For his supporters, it became a rallying cry, a banner of resistance. For his critics, it was a difficult, complicated moment. Some admitted the line was powerful. Others dismissed it as grandstanding. But even those who hated him, most couldn't ignore the resonance of the words. Now here's where the story twists. Because the internet never just observes. It reacts. It twists. It magnifies. Memes appeared almost instantly. Some glorified him, framing him as a martyr. Others mocked the moment, turning the phrase into punchlines. That's the dark irony of the digital age. Tragedy becomes both sacred and satirical within minutes. But while the online storm raged, something else was happening in real life. Students who had been in the room began posting their own accounts. They described not just what Charlie said, but how he said it. One witness wrote, "It didn't sound like a man scared for his life. It sounded like a man leaving a message for history." Another said, "I felt chills. The second he said it, I knew we'd be hearing that line for the rest of our lives." And then came the moment that made everything worse. Footage of the shooter surfaced. Shaky cell phone clips captured the elderly man being restrained, his face blank, his voice calm as he repeated, "I have the right to remain silent." 2 sentences. That's all the world had. One from the man dying. One from the man who killed. Both destined to be remembered. And here's the chilling part. Side by side, those clips went viral together. Charlie's defiance versus the shooter's silence. A clash of words and no words. A fight between speech and suppression. People began to frame it almost like a symbolic battle. The activist who believed words lived forever, and the gunman who believed silence had the final say. Which side do you think won? Because online, it looked like Charlie's words had crushed the silence. But investigators weren't so sure. As detectives combed through footage, something caught their attention. In one clip, grainy, zoomed in, shaky, viewers claimed you could see something in the shooter's eyes. A cold glare. A kind of resolve that didn't fit the picture of an old, frail man acting in random desperation. Pause on that. Doesn't that disturb you? This wasn't rage. This wasn't confusion. It was intent. Calculated. Almost rehearsed. So the question became, was this more than just a random act of violence? Was this meant to be theater? A twisted performance where one man speaks his final words, and another chooses silence as his counterpoint? Theories erupted online. Some insisted the shooter was making a political statement by refusing to explain himself. Others suggested he was part of a larger plot, instructed to say nothing. And still others whispered something even darker, that he wanted Charlie's words to spread, that he wanted to create a martyr. Think about that. What if his silence wasn't just resistance, it was fuel? What if by saying nothing, he gave Charlie's voice even more power? It's the kind of contradiction that keeps you up at night. Meanwhile, families, politicians, and commentators rushed to react. Supporters framed Charlie as a fallen warrior for free speech. Critics struggled with how to address the tragedy without endorsing the man's politics. The media spun narratives, each headline sharpening the divide. But while the nation argued, one detail was being overlooked. A detail buried inside the videos. A flicker in the shooter's expression. A subtle motion. Something so small most people missed it entirely. And when investigators slowed the footage frame by frame, what they discovered changed everything. Because in that moment, just before the shot was fired, there was a look, a glance, a movement so chilling that once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. And that detail raised a question far more terrifying than silence. Was this really about Charlie Kirk at all? That's how commentators across the world began to frame what had happened in that Utah lecture hall. It wasn't just a shooting anymore. It had become something bigger, almost mythic, the silence of the gunman against the voice of the activist. Two men embodying two ideas, one withholding, one declaring. And here's the thing, people crave symbolism. In the chaos of tragedy, we search for meaning. We want to believe there's a lesson, a message, something beyond random violence. And this event gave us plenty to wrestle with. Charlie Kirk, love him or hate him, was a man who built his life around words. He thrived on debates, speeches, sound bites that went viral. His entire legacy was built on the belief that speaking truth, or at least speaking boldly, could change the world. So when his last act on earth was to speak, defiant, unflinching, it fit the story of his life. The shooter, on the other hand, chose silence. 6 words about his legal right, and then nothing. No manifesto, no explanation, no justification. Just silence. Almost like he wanted to be the void. Almost like he wanted to prove that silence itself could be more powerful than speech. Now here's where it gets interesting. History is filled with these juxtapositions. Think about Martin Luther King Jr., a man who used words as his weapon. When he was killed, people feared the silence of his absence. But what happened? His speeches, his words, his "I have a dream," rang louder than ever. Or take John Lennon, silenced by a gunman, but his lyrics, his calls for peace, his voice, immortalized. Even further back, think of Socrates, condemned to drink poison, silenced by the state. But his dialogues, his words, still studied thousands of years later. Over and over, we see it. The attempt to silence a voice only amplifies it. Violence kills the man, but not the message. And yet, there's a contradiction here. Because silence has its own power too. The shooter's refusal to explain left a vacuum, and vacuums get filled. His silence made the world project its own fears, suspicions, theories onto him. He became an empty vessel for every nightmare people wanted to imagine. Isn't that eerie? Charlie's words lived on because they were spoken. The shooter's influence spread because he said nothing. Words and silence feeding off each other, creating two narratives locked in battle. So which is stronger, speech or silence? Let me ask you directly. If you had the choice, Would you rather leave the world remembered for your words or remembered for your silence? That's the philosophical tug-of-war this tragedy has created. And here's where the symbolism deepens. The university, a place meant for free exchange of ideas, became the stage where silence and speech collided violently. A hall built for words was torn apart by a gunshot and sealed in silence. You can't script symbolism darker than that. People started saying it wasn't just a crime, it was a clash of ideologies. Some argued that Charlie Kirk's words proved once and for all that voices can't be silenced. Others countered that the shooter's silence showed that sometimes the absence of words can be even more haunting than the words themselves. But while the world debated philosophy, the very real human cost of the tragedy was being felt behind closed doors. Because beyond politics, beyond symbolism, there were families grieving. A wife, a circle of friends, a community of supporters, and their heartbreak would soon burst into the public eye in a way that reignited the firestorm. And when those closest to Charlie spoke for the first time, their words carried a pain and a revelation that no one was prepared to hear. That's the paradox of Charlie Kirk's life, and it became the theme of his legacy after that final moment. Because the truth is, Charlie was never neutral ground. He was a polarizing figure, a man who built his brand on confrontation, on challenging the mainstream, on sparking outrage as much as applause. And in the wake of his death, those very traits only amplified. Let's rewind for a moment. Before the tragedy, who was Charlie Kirk to the people who followed him? To his supporters, he was a warrior, unafraid to say what others tiptoed around, a champion of conservative youth, a voice for those who felt drowned out on college campuses. He founded Turning Point USA, debated professors, sparred with activists, and filled lecture halls with students eager to watch him go toe-to-toe with critics. His charisma wasn't Hollywood polish, it was bluntness. His style wasn't polished diplomacy, it was raw conviction. That's why his base loved him. But let's not forget the other side. To his detractors, Charlie was dangerous. They called him a provocateur, a propagandist, someone who thrived on division. His critics accused him of oversimplifying complex issues, of whipping up outrage, of stoking flames rather than calming them. They wrote articles, launched counter-campaigns, filled comment sections with fury. And yet, even they admitted something. He was impossible to ignore. That's the thing about polarizing figures. They draw energy from both sides. Admiration from some, outrage from others, and both keep the spotlight fixed squarely on them. Charlie understood that better than most. He leaned into it, used it, fed on it. And that's why his final words landed with such force. Because whether you believed in him or despised him, you felt them. You couldn't deny the gravity. Now, here's where the story takes another turn. In the aftermath of his death, politicians wasted no time reacting. Right-wing leaders hailed him as a martyr for free speech. Speeches were given, flags were lowered at events, hashtags were turned into rallying cries. His death became a symbol. Meanwhile, critics wrestled with how to respond. Some stayed silent, fearing backlash. Others offered condolences but couldn't bring themselves to praise him. And a few outspoken voices argued that his ideas shouldn't be sanctified just because he died tragically. That tension only deepened the divide. But here's the irony. Whether praising him or condemning him, everyone was talking about him. In death, Charlie Kirk became bigger than he ever was in life. His words, his videos, his speeches surged online. His book sales spiked. Old clips of his debates resurfaced. Supporters shared them as proof of his brilliance. Critics shared them as warnings of his influence. Either way, his reach multiplied overnight. This is the cruel, ironic cycle of martyrdom. When a polarizing figure dies suddenly, their legacy doesn't shrink. It expands. The silence of their absence forces the world to replay their words louder than ever before. And here's where it cuts even deeper. In the weeks before the shooting, Charlie had given interviews where he hinted at the dangers he faced. He spoke about threats, about the risks of speaking on campuses, about the possibility of violence. He once even said, "If something ever happens to me, at least I'll know I didn't waste my voice." Was that foreshadowing? Was it paranoia? Or was it a man who knew, deep down, that his life was walking a razor's edge? Now think about the impact this has on his family, his closest allies. They're not just grieving. They're grappling with the fact that Charlie's death transformed him into a symbol overnight. His supporters call him a hero. His critics still call him dangerous. And his family? They're left holding the truth that he was, beyond all the noise, simply a husband, a friend, a son. That's the raw human cost of legacy. It isn't clean. It isn't simple. It's messy, emotional, contradictory. But here's the twist that no one saw coming. Because just as the nation was beginning to settle into grief and debate, whispers began to surface. Whispers that this wasn't just a random act of violence. That maybe, just maybe, Charlie hadn't been targeted by accident. And when the first pieces of that puzzle started falling into place, the story of his death shifted from tragedy to something far more sinister. That was the driving force in the hours and days after the shooting. Why would an elderly man, a figure who looked more like someone's grandfather than a criminal, walk into a university auditorium and fire at Charlie Kirk? Was this personal? Political? Or was there something even deeper? Something orchestrated? Something hidden? From the moment the suspect was taken into custody, investigators knew this wasn't going to be simple. The shooter gave them nothing. No confession. No apology. No explanation. Just the same cold line. I have the right to remain silent. That meant detectives had to start piecing together the story themselves, brick by brick, detail by detail. First came the obvious, his identity. Records revealed a retired man in his 70s. No violent criminal past. No arrests. Neighbors described him as quiet, polite, the kind of man who waved when he collected his mail. I never would have thought he'd do something like this, one woman told reporters. He was just normal. But isn't that always the chilling part? How many times have we heard those words after a tragedy? He seemed normal. He was quiet. I never suspected. It's the banality of evil. It hides in plain sight. Detectives dug deeper. They found financial stress, medical issues, and, most troubling, an online trail that painted a darker picture. Old forum posts filled with bitterness. Rants about politics, about free speech, about America losing its way. It wasn't the kind of unhinged manifesto the media might expect, but it was enough to suggest a simmering anger. An anger that had been stewing for years. And here's where the case cracked open. Buried in his digital footprint were references, not just to politics broadly, but to Charlie Kirk specifically. Old clips of his speeches, snippets of debates, and scattered comments that hinted at obsession. Nothing clear enough to scream threat, but enough to prove that this man had been following Charlie for a long time. Now let me ask you, doesn't that make you wonder? Was this act spontaneous, or was it building for years? Investigators began to suspect the latter, and when they traced his movements in the weeks leading up to the shooting, the theory only grew stronger. He had purchased a bus ticket. He had scoped out multiple universities where Charlie was scheduled to appear. He wasn't just attending that day as a random guest. He had planned this. And then there was the detail that stunned detectives most. A notebook found in his home. It wasn't a manifesto, not exactly. It was more like a journal. Pages filled with fragments, questions about freedom, bitterness about America, rants about politicians. And scrawled on one page, barely legible but unmistakable, were these words: "Sometimes silence is louder than speech." Chills, right? That line seemed to echo his very behavior after the shooting. He had planned to remain silent. He had written it down. Silence wasn't just his defense, it was his strategy. But strategy for what? That's the question that investigators couldn't shake. Was he trying to erase his motives, forcing the world to speculate forever? Or was he trying to elevate Charlie's final words by creating a twist? And then came the part that turned the case from bizarre to terrifying. Detectives discovered that the shooter had once been a guest lecturer decades ago at another university. Not on politics, but on philosophy. He had taught students about Socrates, about Plato, about the power of silence in argument. That revelation reframed everything. This wasn't just a shooter. This was a man who believed in silence as a kind of ideology. Now think about that for a second. Charlie Kirk, a man who built his empire on words, on volume, on debate, cut down by a man who believed silence was stronger than speech. The symbolism wasn't just coincidence, it was intentional. But what detectives uncovered next pushed the investigation into darker territory. Because tucked away in that notebook, amid the scribbles and rants, was a single name that suggested the shooter hadn't acted alone. A name investigators recognized. A name that tied him to a shadowy circle with motives far bigger than just one elderly man and one political figure. And that discovery would flip the narrative completely, because it suggested this wasn't just personal vendetta. This was something far more organized, far more deliberate. And once that name went public, the world would never look at this tragedy the same way again. That was the question tearing across the nation as soon as news of the shooting spread. On the surface, it looked like a straightforward tragedy. A lone elderly man, armed and bitter, striking out in violence. But almost immediately, whispers began to swirl online. Something about it didn't add up. Something about the details felt too sharp, too symbolic, too deliberate. Let's be honest, when a high-profile figure dies in shocking fashion, conspiracy theories are inevitable. They sprout like wildfire. But in this case, they weren't just fringe ramblings. They spread fast, loud, and wide. Some people argued that Charlie Kirk was assassinated, not attacked. That this wasn't the action of one isolated man, but the hand of something bigger. They pointed to the shooter's calm demeanor, his calculated silence, the eerie phrase in his notebook, "Sometimes silence is louder than speech." Was that just coincidence, or was it part of a larger script? Others believed the government had a hand in it. To them, the shooter was nothing more than a pawn, a fall guy meant to obscure the real forces pulling strings. Why else would a man so old, so frail, suddenly carry out something this drastic? Why would he choose silence, unless he had been instructed to keep quiet? And then came the wildest theories, that Charlie's last words themselves were planted. That maybe the clip wasn't authentic. That maybe the audio was enhanced, edited, even scripted. It's too perfect, skeptics said. It's like he was rehearsing a movie scene. Those doubts only grew as the footage was replayed thousands of times across social media. Now, pause for a moment. Imagine being one of the students in that hall, grieving, traumatized, and then seeing strangers online pick apart your memories, suggesting what you saw with your own eyes wasn't real. That's the double-edged sword of tragedy in the digital age. Nothing is sacred. Everything is questioned. But here's where things turned from speculation to suspicion. Investigators leaked, quietly, off the record, that the shooter's phone showed encrypted messages. Messages sent and received days before the shooting. The content wasn't public, but the existence of them was enough to ignite a firestorm. Who was he talking to? Who knew? And why did he wipe most of his digital footprint in the hours before he struck? Doesn't that sound less like a random act, and more like preparation? Meanwhile, supporters of Charlie Kirk claimed the timing was too convenient. He had been gaining traction, filling lecture halls, trending online. Was someone trying to silence his influence by force? Critics dismissed it as paranoia, but the questions wouldn't go away. And then came the theories about the university itself. Why had security been so light? Why did the shooter manage to walk in with a weapon without being noticed? Some whispered about failures. Others suggested complicity. Think about how fragile trust becomes in these moments. A community already shaken now forced to wonder if the very institutions designed to protect them had failed, or worse, looked the other way. The conspiracy machine churned on, fueled by every unanswered question. Was the elderly gunman acting alone? Was he part of a network? Was he silenced into silence himself? But the most chilling theory wasn't about the shooter at all. It was about motive. Because buried beneath all the noise was one question almost no one wanted to confront. What if the goal wasn't to kill Charlie Kirk to stop his voice? What if the goal was to make him a martyr, to amplify his voice louder than ever? That thought, that dark possibility, sent shivers down the spine of even his fiercest critics. Because if true, then the tragedy wasn't just violence. It was theater, a stage crafted for impact. And the one clue that began to tip the scales toward that possibility came not from investigators, not from journalists, but from the voices of eyewitnesses themselves. Because their accounts didn't all align. And in those contradictions lay a revelation that would blow the story wide open. That's the problem with eyewitness accounts. In the aftermath of chaos, the human brain scrambles to make sense of what it saw. Details blur. Perceptions warp. Fear colors memory. But when dozens of voices began to share what they remembered from that auditorium, the inconsistencies weren't just minor. They were seismic. Some students swore the elderly gunman stood calmly, raised his weapon, and fired without hesitation. Others insisted his hands were shaking so violently he nearly dropped it before pulling the trigger. Which was it? Cold precision or trembling panic? One eyewitness claimed Charlie locked eyes with the shooter in those final seconds, staring him down as he spoke his defiant last words. Another swore Charlie was looking toward the ceiling, as if addressing heaven itself. Those details matter. One version makes the line an act of direct defiance. The other frames it as a prayer, a message meant for history rather than his killer. And then came the most unsettling contradiction of all. Several witnesses reported hearing the shooter mutter something before firing. Not, "I have the right to remain silent," but something else entirely. A phrase that, to this day, remains disputed. Some say he whispered, "Now you'll listen." Others claim it was, "This is for them." A few insist he said nothing at all. Now pause. Imagine being in that room, already traumatized, and realizing your memory doesn't match the person sitting next to you. That uncertainty spread like wildfire. Social media pounced on the contradictions, twisting them into fuel for conspiracy theories. If eyewitnesses couldn't agree on what happened, could the truth ever be pinned down? Investigators tried to reconcile the accounts by piecing together video footage. But the clips were shaky, inconsistent, incomplete. One angle seemed to show hesitation. Another made the shot look deliberate. The more they analyzed, the more questions arose. But here's where the story takes a chilling turn. Among the flood of testimonies, one voice stood out. A student seated just 3 rows behind Charlie claimed something others had missed entirely. She said the shooter wasn't looking at Charlie when he pulled the trigger. He was looking past him, at someone else. Think about that. If true, then the act wasn't about killing Charlie Kirk specifically, but about sending a message to someone else in that room. Someone who hasn't yet been identified. Someone who may have been the real target of his glare. Her claim was dismissed by many at first. Shock can distort perception. But then, another witness backed her up. He too swore that in the split second before the gun fired, the shooter's eyes flicked to the side, focusing on a shadowed corner of the hall. Doesn't that raise a terrifying question? What if Charlie wasn't the only target? And here's the cruel irony. Just as Charlie's words were immortalized, the shooter's silence only deepened the mystery. He never clarified. He never explained. He let the contradictions hang in the air, knowing they would multiply. And multiply they did. Because as the investigation deepened, detectives began to realize that these conflicting accounts weren't random. They were clues. Each perspective revealed a different angle of truth, fragments of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. And when those fragments were finally pieced together, they led to a revelation no one was ready to hear. Because hidden inside those contradictions was a detail that changed the entire narrative of the shooting and pointed to a motive darker than anyone had imagined. How do you grieve a man whose voice filled stadiums? That was the unspoken question weighing heavy on the people closest to Charlie Kirk in the days after his death. Because while the world debated symbolism, conspiracies, and contradictions, his family, friends, and supporters were living through something far more personal: heartbreak. His wife, his parents, his colleagues. They weren't thinking about hashtags or viral clips. They were thinking about an empty chair at the dinner table, about phone calls they'd never get to make again, about a man who had been loud and alive one moment and gone the next. The emotional fallout was immediate and raw. In interviews, you could see it on their faces. The shock hadn't even settled before the cameras were shoved in front of them, demanding sound bites for the world to consume. Some couldn't speak at all. Others tried, their voices breaking, their eyes swollen from tears. His mother reportedly whispered, "He was still my little boy." Those words, carried by reporters, shattered even some of his harshest critics. And then there were his supporters. For them, Charlie's death wasn't just personal, It was political, spiritual, symbolic. Vigils sprang up overnight. Candles lit on campuses. Posters plastered across cities with his face and his final words in bold letters. You can't silence a voice by killing the man who speaks it. They wept not only for the man, but for what they felt he represented. But grief doesn't just unify, it divides. Critics of Charlie Kirk struggled with their own emotions. Some admitted they never agreed with him, but no one deserved to die that way. Others clashed with his supporters online, arguing that his ideas were dangerous and should not be sanctified simply because of his death. These arguments tore through social media, turning mourning into a battleground. And in the middle of it all, families and students who just wanted peace. One particularly haunting image came from the funeral service. Cameras caught rows of young people, students who had been in the auditorium that day, sitting silently, candles flickering in their hands, staring at the casket. Some sobbed uncontrollably. Others sat stone-faced, too shocked to process what they'd seen. And then came the moment that left everyone speechless. At the service, a speaker read aloud Charlie's last words. And as the sentence echoed through the church, there was a pause, a silence so heavy you could feel it pressing down. People cried openly. Some stood and clapped. Others bowed their heads. For a few seconds, grief, anger, love, and defiance all collided in that one room. But grief has a way of revealing hidden truths. In the weeks that followed, as those closest to Charlie began to speak more openly, details surfaced that added new layers to the tragedy. His wife admitted that Charlie had confided in her about threats. He told me he felt like someone was watching him, she said. I thought he was just being dramatic. Now I'll never forgive myself for not taking it seriously. Supporters seized on that revelation. Had Charlie sensed danger? Had he known his life was at risk? Critics dismissed it as grief speaking. But the possibility added fuel to the firestorm already raging online. And then, something unexpected happened. At a memorial held by students, a banner was unfurled. On it were the words of Charlie's final sentence, but scribbled underneath, in a smaller, shakier hand, were the words, "But silence has its own voice too." No one knew who wrote it. Some said it was a student reflecting on the eerie contrast between Charlie's defiance and the shooter's silence. Others suspected it was something darker, someone trying to insert the gunman's ideology into the very memorial meant to honor Charlie. Whatever the truth, it sent chills through the crowd, because it reminded everyone that grief wasn't the end of the story. Grief was only the beginning. And as detectives followed the trail of that strange message, what they uncovered next revealed that the tragedy wasn't just about loss. It was about a war of words and silence that was still unfolding, even beyond Charlie's death. The shot that shook America's students. That's what the headlines screamed in the weeks after Charlie Kirk's death. Because while his family mourned and his supporters grieved, college campuses across the nation were grappling with something far bigger than one man. They were staring at a new reality. If a speaker could be silenced by violence inside a lecture hall, then what did that mean for the future of debate, of free speech, of safety and education? Picture the atmosphere on campuses in the days that followed. Flyers with Charlie's face were plastered on walls. Student groups clashed in heated protests, some holding candles in quiet vigils, others chanting that his legacy should not be glorified. On one campus, a wall of flowers and handwritten notes appeared overnight. On another, graffiti screamed, "Silence wins." Universities scrambled to respond. Administrators rushed out emails assuring students that campuses were safe, that security would be tightened, that free speech would not be compromised. But fear doesn't vanish with a press release. Students whispered about whether lectures were still safe to attend. Parents called their children nonstop, demanding they skip events. Professors looked over their shoulders while teaching. Doesn't that tell you something chilling? That a single shot in Utah rippled across an entire nation, altering how thousands of students viewed the very places meant to shape their minds. And then came the debates. Not the academic kind, but the cultural kind. On talk shows, pundits clashed. Was this about gun control, free speech, or political division? Some argued it was proof that universities had become too dangerous for controversial figures. Others insisted silencing voices through violence was proof we needed more dialogue, not less. The irony was stark. A man who lived to debate had died, and now the debate about his death consumed the country. But on the ground, among the students, the emotions were less polished, more raw. Survivors of the Utah lecture hall described sleepless nights, panic attacks, even guilt. One student said, "Every time I walk into a classroom, I wonder if someone might stand up with a gun." Another admitted, "I hear his voice in my head when I sit down at my desk. I can't stop replaying it." And here's where it gets even darker. Some students began imitating Charlie's final words, shouting them at rallies, writing them in chalk across sidewalks, plastering them on posters. For them, it was empowerment. But for others, it felt like trauma being relived over and over. The very words meant to inspire had become a trigger for those who had lived through the terror firsthand. Universities faced impossible choices: cancel events and risk accusations of censorship, or press forward and risk more violence. Some canceled. Others doubled down, hiring more security, installing metal detectors, even creating safe zones for students who felt threatened by controversial speakers. But amid the chaos, one truth emerged. The lecture hall had become more than a crime scene. It had become a symbol. And here's the cruel twist. Charlie Kirk died in a university, a place designed for free exchange of ideas. His death transformed that space from a sanctuary of debate into a battlefield of ideology. Suddenly, the very mission of higher education, conversation, confrontation, learning, was under attack. And yet, even as fear spread, so did something else. His final words, etched onto banners, repeated in chants, shared online, became part of student culture. For some, a call to courage. For others, a warning of danger. Either way, they would not fade. And then something extraordinary happened. One university, trying to honor the tragedy, announced they would etch Charlie's last words into a memorial plaque on campus. It was meant as a gesture of healing, of remembrance. But the announcement backfired. Within hours, protests erupted. Some students claimed immortalizing his words glorified a figure they opposed. Others insisted it was necessary, that to erase them would be to let the shooter's silence win. The campus erupted into a shouting match. Not over the shooting itself, but over the legacy of a single sentence. And that's the irony, isn't it? One man's voice had been silenced by a bullet, but now his words were louder than ever, dividing students, uniting others, sparking fights in classrooms, dorms, and dining halls. But while campuses wrestled with memorials and protests, detectives were still piecing together a much larger puzzle. And what they uncovered in the shooter's past suggested that this tragedy wasn't just about one university or one activist. Because the man behind the trigger had lived a life filled with secrets. And those secrets, once revealed, would cast the entire tragedy in a new, even darker light.